Hello, everyone. My name is Eoin White, and I am the Portfolio Decarbonisation Manager at the Science Based Targets Initiative. And it's my pleasure to be here today at the 2022 ShinaPac ESG Forum, where I will speak about science-based target setting in the financial sector. Before I begin, I'd also like to give a special thanks to Shen-Chi Kwan, the chairman of the ShinaPac Financial Holdings, and also to thank Li Zi-Lun, the CEO of the Office of Energy and Carbon Reduction. I'd like to thank them for their kind invitations. So I will just share my screen now, which has the presentation that I will run through. So my goal today is to describe how science-based targets are used in the financial sector to help different types of financial institutions to align their portfolios with the goals of the Paris Agreement. So I'll start first of all with a small introduction to the SBTi. So the Science-Based Targets Initiative, it is composed of 4 global partner organizations: CDP, the UN Global Compact, the World Resources Institute, and WWF International. And these 4 organizations came together in 2015 to launch the SBTi. And the goal of the SBTi is fourfold. So first of all, we build the technical foundations to translate global climate science into specific pathways for corporates and financial institutions so that they can also align their own activities with these global climate goals. We also then try to scale up adoption and institutionalization by embedding SBTs in capital markets and also working to make sure that SBTs become standard business practice and that all companies start to disclose greenhouse gas emission estimates and figures, and also start to set targets to reduce those greenhouse gas emissions. And then finally, we provide an independent validation system where companies and financial institutions can submit their targets to the SBTi and they can have them independently and third-party verified. So what actually is an SBT? And really the question came for how do investors and other stakeholders ensure that their companies and their own portfolios are also consistent and aligning with the goals of the Paris Agreement, which were to keep temperatures to at least well below 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. And as part of this system, there's 3 key steps. So you often hear that the first step is long-term goal of net zero emissions. So the global economy must reach net zero emissions by 2050, and we expect that all companies and financial institutions will also align with this wider goal. The second element of this system then is a science-based target, and the science-based target is simply a greenhouse gas reduction target whose ambition is consistent with the Paris Agreement, and essentially it defines the rate of emission reductions that have to happen to stay aligned with that goal. And the third element of this system then is our annual disclosure platform, where companies and financial institutions should disclose annually their progress towards meeting those targets. And the SBTi has grown significantly. So in the 7 years that we've been existing, we have now grown to over 2,000 companies who are working with the SBTi globally. It represents about 20 to 25% of global market capitalization. So a significant portion of the world's companies are actually now setting these greenhouse gas emission reduction targets that are being verified by the SBTi. When it comes to then the different methods that we have available, back in September 2015, we launched methods for what we call the real economy, and that allowed us to have target setting methods for all sectors of the economy except for finance. So back in October 2020, we released a special guidance for financial institutions because financial institutions play a special role in the economy and they have a special influence over companies through their investing and lending activities. And we wanted to create a unique framework just for the finance sector so that they could use this special influence to help the wider economy to achieve net zero. And this is the framework I'm going to discuss today, is to focus on different types of financial institutions and how they can align their lending and investment activities. So I also wanted to kind of just for financial institutions to highlight the fact that when we're talking about net zero, the net zero is the long-term goal. And as I mentioned before, what we want, we're defining now a standard for financial institutions of what it means for a financial institution to become net zero. So what does that ultimate goal look like for a financial institution? But it also means that financial institutions will still need to set Paris-aligned near-term targets to ensure that they define that path towards the long-term goal. And we already have published that standard for the near-term targets, and we're working to publish the standard for those long-term net zero targets at the beginning of next year. And the key elements of net zero for financial institutions, which we will define, will focus on 4 key elements. The first of all, definitions, defining what actually is net zero for a financial institution. How should it be defined? The second element will be the focus of carbon credits. What role should financial institutions play in financing carbon credits and negative emissions? Third element is fossil fuel financing. How should financial institutions specifically address their financing of the fossil fuel sector, as the fossil fuel sector is the largest emitting sector? And then finally, metrics and methods. What methods and metrics can financial institutions best use to track the impact of their portfolios and to show that it is reducing over time? So that's going to be our long-term net zero standard. And how we see this fitting into the wider ecosystem is the SBTi provides the independent scientific development for specific aspects of target setting. So as I mentioned, for example, such as fossil fuel financing rules and also guidance around carbon credits. And then we also do a lot of harmonization with other peer initiatives. So the GFANZ Alliance, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, and there's now many global UN convened net zero alliances. So we have a net zero asset managers, net zero banking alliance, net zero asset managers. The SBTi works very closely with these organizations to ensure that we have as much consistency and harmonization as possible across the wider ecosystem so that the financial institutions can set consistent targets that can be recognized by all institutions. So what I would like to do now is actually deep dive a little bit into the framework itself and describe the steps that any financial institution can take to actually set a target on their own financing activities. So the first element is there's 4 key elements of the framework. The first is we have criteria, and these are the quantitative and qualitative rules that financial institutions could follow to actually set those targets. We also have a guidance document available, and this should be a great first place to start if anyone is not familiar with the framework. This framework contains a lot of background information, also some case studies of how different banks and asset managers, for example, have actually started. We have a number of methods available, which I'll describe in a little bit more detail, and we have a number of tools available online, both in Excel-based and also Python-coded base, that institutions can use. So we have a lot of resources available that I'll describe in a little bit more detail to start this target setting journey. And the audience for this framework is primarily banks, asset managers, asset owners, and mortgage real estate investment trusts. And we are also then working to define additional methods for sovereign wealth, for insurance, and for private equity. And I'll describe that also in a little bit more detail shortly. But effectively, what I'm going to describe now is a 3-step process that we have to actually set a target. So the first step is defining what is the boundary of the target. So what activities are considered within scope. So we take an asset class approach. So we only need to cover asset classes that are mandatory under our framework. And I'll describe what those are later. So you don't have to include all financing activities right now. You only have to include certain asset classes. The next element is, once you've defined the boundary of the target, is to select an appropriate method for achieving that target. And we use methods that use a portfolio or a Paris alignment based approach, which can help to ensure that we have real world emission reductions. And then finally, the third and final step is how to define the ambition of those targets and how do we gather the necessary data and information to ultimately achieve those targets. So I'm going to go through each of those 3 steps now with some examples of what this looks like in practice. So for the first step, it is determining the target boundary. So as I mentioned, we use a asset class approach, not a total portfolio-based approach, which means that you only need to cover asset classes that are currently in scope, and those asset classes will be expanding over time. So right now we have asset classes for consumer finance, which is residential mortgages. We can cover corporate loans, also corporate equity and bonds, and we have methods for private equity. So all of those different types of asset classes can be included in the scope of the targets, but we currently do not have methods available for other asset classes such as personal finance or sovereign debt, any type of capital market securities underwriting, or any type of insurance underwriting activities. And what will happen is the targets, the boundary will be expanded over time as we add more and more asset classes and more methods. But it means ultimately that there's no need to cover all activities at this time. You only have to cover the activities that are within the scope. So I'm going to give an example of what this actually looks like in practice. So La Banque Postale is a French bank, and it was one of the first banks that was approved under the SBTi framework. And they included 85% of their investment lending activities that was available. We had methods available to cover those activities, which included their mortgages, their commercial real estate, electricity project finance, and their listed equity and bonds. They did not include then SME lending, private equity, sovereign debt, or their advisory services. So these were considered out of scope because we don't have mandatory methods yet for those asset classes. So there's a number of approaches here, and just to highlight the fact that there's no minimum percentage coverage. So for La Banque Postale, they achieved 85% coverage, but we have KB Financial, a South Korean bank. When they did their assessment of boundary, they only covered 13% because that was essentially only 13% of their activities were considered mandatory. So if certain institutions, for example, they maybe have large amounts of sovereign debt or personal consumer finance, that would not have to be captured under the scope of the target. So, you can also have a low starting percentage, and that would increase over time. The second element of our framework then is selecting an appropriate target setting method. So we have a general principle of what we call the Paris alignment approach. And our goal really is that within any asset class, so be it corporate loans, be it equity or bonds, the goal essentially is to ensure that we can increase the level of alignment within that portfolio. So when we look at all of the companies in those portfolios, the goal is to ensure that we can have more and more of those companies who are themselves setting targets and reducing their emissions aligned with the Paris Agreement. So we do not set portfolio-wide financed emissions targets. That's not our goal because we feel that that ultimately leads to more divestment. So rather than actually tracking all of the emissions of the individual portfolio companies and reducing those over time, the goal is much more of an engagement-based approach. And we have two key methods available for this. So we have our SDA-based approach, which is available for certain heavy industry sectors, and particularly the banking sector likes to use the SDA. They can set very specific targets for certain sectors. And then for all other sectors, we use engagement-based approaches where the goal of the financial institution is to engage the company for that company to set their own greenhouse gas reduction target and to reduce their emissions. And collectively then these have the goal of ultimately aligning portfolios with Paris over time so that financial institutions can track the fact that all of its financing will ultimately be aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement. So to give you an example of what this looks like, within asset classes then, depending on the sectors that you're investing in or you're financing, you can set different types of targets. So for example, for the SDA sectors, which is kind of the heavy emission sectors, you can set specific reduction targets. So for power generation, for real estate, cement, steel, you can set specific percentage-based reduction targets. But for all other sectors where we don't have a specific sector pathway, so for example, agriculture, pharmaceuticals, manufacturing, ICT, technology-based sectors, for those sectors, we essentially set engagement-based targets where you engage the customers or your portfolio companies for those companies to set their own targets. And on the right-hand side here, we have an example of what this looks like for 3 methods. So I'll start with the SDA because it's also most relevant for banking. And we have examples here of KB Financial, and they set a specific target. So they commit to reducing greenhouse gas emissions from their power generation sector within its corporate instruments, so equity, bonds, and loans, 49.3% per megawatt hour. So what effectively this target is committing is that all of their financing to this sector, they are going to reduce its emissions intensity over time, aligned with our SDA method. And KB Financial have done that for a number of sectors, which I'll show you a little bit later. But we also then have, for the non-SDA sectors, we have our portfolio coverage method, which essentially is where a financial institution commits that a growing number of their portfolio companies also set SBTs. So for an example here will be a bank committing that 35% of its listed equity and bonds will have SBTi validated targets by a certain year. And for temperature rating, what that does is we can convert the ambition of your existing portfolio companies into a temperature score. And the goal then is to decrease that temperature score over time, which essentially means that more and more of the portfolio companies will set ambitious targets. So these are the 2 main approaches, and I have an example on the next slide of what this looks like in practice. So this is KB Financial Group, so the South Korean banking group I mentioned. And we're going to look here at 2 different asset classes. So the first is all of their commercial real estate lending. And for this target, they have set an SDA, so sector-based target of 59% reduction per square meter. So they will essentially calculate all of the emissions associated with each of the real estate buildings that they finance, and they will set a target on that. So, and when we looked at their wider corporate loan book, they also set these sector-based SDA targets for all of the important heavy emitting sectors. So power generation, paper and pulp, iron and steel, aluminium. They have specific emission reduction targets. And this is a very common trend across the banking sector, is to focus on those most important high impact heavy emitting sectors first, set sector-based targets on those first, and then to include what we call all of the other sectors. And for KB Financial, they have chosen to use a temperature rating based method to cover all the other sectors, and then the goal being to reduce the temperature of those portfolios and of the lending to those other sectors over time to reach that 1.5 degree goal. And effectively, again, that temperature target commits that lending to all other sectors, they will calculate the ambition of the customers that they're lending to based on, do the customers already have a public greenhouse gas reduction plan? And if they do have that plan, they can convert that to a temperature. And their goal being that they want those customers to have more and more ambitious reduction plans over time. And this then will help the bank to actually achieve their target. So it's an engagement-based approach. And then the final element of this approach is to look at the defining target ambition. What we're seeing with most companies who submit their information to the SBTi is to look within any given portfolio, be it a corporate loan portfolio, equity portfolio, and they will start to look at the different types of data required to set these targets. So what we can see here in the table, for example, is we have different types of data. So the SBTi status simply says, which of your portfolio companies already have an approved science-based target. So some of them are approved, some of them might be committed to setting a target, and many others might not be committed. So for the portfolio coverage method, the goal simply in this portfolio is to increase the number of companies who actually have an approved target. So it's a very simple method from that perspective because it doesn't require a lot of input information. It's a very simple, does the company have a target, yes or no? For our temperature rating method then, it's a little bit more sophisticated because if they don't already have an SBTi approval, we check do they have any other form of public greenhouse gas target, and then we can convert the ambition of that target into a temperature rating. And we can see here in the fourth column, we have the different temperatures associated with those companies. And the goal then of the target is to reduce those temperatures aligned to well below 2 degrees and ideally 1.5 degrees Celsius. And for the SDA method I mentioned, which is again common for the banks in the high emitting sectors, we use a SDA based approach where they calculate the emissions that they own, so the emissions that are associated with their specific lending. So for each company, they can calculate the financed emissions, and we use the global PCAF-based approach. So PCAF is the Partnership for Carbon Accounting in Financials, and it is the global standard for greenhouse gas accounting of financed emissions. And they can use that to calculate then the emissions associated with their financing for certain high-impact sectors. So as we saw for KB Financial, they did this method for the power generation sector, paper and pulp, commercial real estate. And we can use this method then to calculate. So a lot of different types of information is required, from the very easy targets such as portfolio coverage all the way through to SDA, which does require a lot more information from companies. So when financial institutions are going to set these targets, they need to ensure that they are really engaged with their customers and their portfolio companies so they can gather sufficient information to be able to set those targets. So I wanted to quickly show what this, for example, looks like from an SDA perspective. Here's an example we have of the SDA being used for commercial real estate or mortgages. And what the goal of the target is first of all to calculate the emissions intensity of the sector. So you do calculate all of the tons of greenhouse gas emissions from the real estate that is in your portfolio, and that is divided then by the total area of that real estate. And you can compare the intensity of your current portfolio to the sector average intensity. And the goal then is to reduce that over time along these global pathways. So the chart here shows the fact that for many sectors, we have global pathways, both for 2 degrees, well below 2 degrees and 1.5. So we know we can compare given set portfolios, compare them to the sectors, and then very easily set the targets. We know how much they have to reduce the emissions by each year. And then for our portfolio coverage and temperature rating target, a lot of this information is available on the SBTi website. So the first step will be to define for the customers or your portfolio companies, do they have a public greenhouse gas reduction target that has been approved by the SBTi? And as I mentioned, now we have over 1,000 companies who do have approved targets, and another 1,000 companies who are currently in the process of setting that target. So the public information contains a lot of good quality data. And then for the companies, for example, who don't have an approved science-based target, we can check, do they have any other form of target, and calculate the ambition. So data providers, for example, like CDP, through our annual disclosure system, we collect target data on over 4,000 companies. So there's a lot of companies out there who are setting targets, and there's a lot of information available that can be used then to calculate the ambition of those companies. So this is the information that is required then as an input into the target setting process. So that's a very brief overview of the SBTi FI targets. I would also like to highlight that you can visit our website, sciencebasedtargets.org, and on that website you'll find a kind of step-by-step guide and a lot more information for financial institutions to set science-based targets and to submit those targets to the SBTi for validation. We have launched a new booking system recently where you can also then reserve a space in our validation system if you would like your targets to be reviewed in the coming months. And also on our website, then you will find an overview of all of the other financial institutions who already have submitted targets. We currently have approximately 20 financial institutions who've gone through the process, and we're currently in the process of validating an additional 10 more. So there's lots of banks, asset managers, asset owners, private equity firms, which are now stepping up to set these targets. So hopefully you will be able to find that information on our website very useful to start your journey also. So I will stop there, and I would like to, thank you again for the invitation to speak today, and also thank you for your attention and patience in listening to this presentation. Thank you. Bye-bye.